Beautiful.
Welcome.
Beautiful. So, yet again, ladies and gentlemen who are listening, we're talking with Dr. Scott Wostenberg, the wonderful chiropractor out of Queensland, who knows all about all things. If you want to get in touch with Scotty, feel free to give him a call on 0733710222. That is the right number, isn't it?
That's it.
Ah, beautiful. I was worried if I gave out the wrong number, that would be it. Anyway, but Optimal Life Chiropractic. Google it. You will not be, you'll not be sorry. And then if you want to get in touch with me, Eric at brainandbodyhealth.com.au, and I promise I will email you back. All right, mate. How's your week been?
Well, it's been a pretty entertaining week. We've had several interesting occurrences turn up this week. I had a patient who I sent to get some blood testing done. I've had a couple of interesting ones with that this week. We had a patient turn up after blood testing with an albumin level of 28. Now, good is about 42, 43. So 28 is well below the bottom of the range. And in the last kind of few months, she's put on about 25 kilos of body weight. Now, it's all been basically fluid. So at that moment, she'd reported 3 kilos of increase in weight. No, 5 kilos rather, across 3 days. So across the weekend, she put on significant amounts of weight.
Oh, that's an inflammatory reaction if ever I heard one.
It's particularly not good. And so what we started looking at is the simple fact that her blood ions, the acidity and alkalinity in the system was so poor that there actually wasn't enough osmotic pressure in her bloodstream to actually suck the fluid back into her bloodstream. And so it was, of course, pulling around the ankles and swelling in her tissue.
I was just about to ask you that, like, surely at a certain point there's so much fluid retention that circulation's got to become compromised, and then, that fluid stasis has got to be a huge problem.
Yeah, well, that's exactly what's gone on. So her system is basically lost, because of the fluid, it's diluted the bloodstream so much that there's just not enough protein, which is the largest amount of negatively charged ionic material in the bloodstream, to be able to balance it out and actually drive the osmotic pumps. Now, of course, at this point, she's up over 100 kilos in body weight, and so she's tired and sore and unable to do enough physical activity to actually drive the fluid around by movement pumping the actual muscles. So, of course, she's stuck in a position where I've had to send her back to her GP and get her put on antidiuretic medication. Now, the second factor with that is, of course, it then starts to look at how much pressure is on the heart, because, of course, you've got all that fluid in the system, you've got an extra large system full stop. It starts to create a situation of atrial fibrillation, which is quite threatening for the patient's total state of health.
Can you just comment on the strain on the heart from a fluid retention point of view as opposed to just fat?
Just say that again.
So, like the amount of pressure or the load on the heart from a heart strain point of view. For a patient like what you're talking about, where we've got a lot of fluid retention, as opposed to someone who's just doesn't have the same level of fluid retention, but does have a lot of fat hanging off their body.
Okay, so the difference between those two situations isn't huge, because in both cases, say you get to 150 kilos. One is because you've got a massive amount of fluid, and one of them's due to a massive amount of fat. Both of them are actually going to put a lot of stress on the heart, because you've got weight that you're actually carrying around, and that extra weight on a smaller heart requires blood pressure change. So the end result is kind of similar. The difference between those two situations in a lot of cases, though, is that the dilution of your electrolytes actually makes it harder for you to keep your muscles firing. So your nerve cells require sodium, potassium to be in a certain balance to actually activate the depolarization of the nerve cell to cause that regulation of nerve cell firing in the heart to actually cause the contractile pump in the first place.
Okay.
So if you've got those out of balance because your sodium, potassium are very dilute because you've got so much fluid retention, you don't have enough negative to positive charge in the bloodstream or in the cells, you're going to have some really interesting electrical imbalances. And this creates a situation where, in this instance, the system really doesn't cope with it particularly well. So she literally came in reporting feeling crap. And so when I saw her today, and I asked, well, did they put you on Lasix? Did they give you antidiuretic medication? She said, yes. I said, how are you feeling since taking it? Well, I didn't take it this morning because I didn't want to be driving over to you needing to pee every 2 minutes. So... And she looked at me like I was an idiot. And you know, I can understand what she's saying because, of course, I'm trying to get 25 kilos of fluid off her. But, you know, you're not going to get rid of 25 kilos of fluid if you aren't taking the medication. And we've got to do it. Like, usually I'd be like...
I suppose at that point of view, that's not a, hey, just stick in a sauna for 30 minutes. That'll sweat that off. You're not sweating out 20 kilos of fluid.
No, it's just you're not gonna get rid of it. Now, we do have other methods available to us in her instance, one of which is that we've got these machines called hypoxies, which are a type of sauna that you exercise in while kind of wearing a vacuum suctioned, like neoprene, but it's a rubberized thick neoprene that you slide your body into like a glove, and the whole machine actually
it just sounds
vacuum.
like some sort of kinky sex exercise you're talking about there, mate. Is that a BDSM thing that someone's actually done research on and gone, you know what, that may be scientifically valid for this certain situation. Here, step into my rubber gimp suit. I'm sure you'll feel better afterwards.
Absolutely, but these are the wonderful things that come out of Europe, as it turns out. Actually, they work really well. They're a bit weird, and like, you know, it wasn't my first thought, but hey, fundamentally, you're in a vacuum pressure box with the neoprene rubber sucking and pressurizing your tissue while you're exercising it, so it squidges the lymphatics to actually keep the fluid moving around the body while it heats you, so it induces sweating, and this helps lose fluid as well.
Interesting. And look, I know from personal experience, and I mean, you know my biochemical history pretty well. My liver detox is pretty ordinary, so I tend to store a lot of toxic crap in my fat cells. So every time I go on a weight loss journey and shed some fat, I end up dumping a whole bunch of toxic crap back into my system, and then surprise, surprise, I feel like crap and my skin gets worse until I clear that stuff out. Would there be a similar situation in your patient as she's like losing all of that weight from a toxic load point of view? Because I'd imagine that the fluid stasis has got to build up some metabolic waste in it, purely from a lack of blood flow point of view.
There's definitely a fair bit of inflammation and metabolic load going on. So complicating the whole situation, we've got a situation of autoimmune thyroiditis, and we've got an indication of diabetes going on. So we have to change her diet, and the medical doctors put her on a diet, and I've put her on a diet as well previously, and I've also run tests for her to prove that she's gluten allergic. But you know, sometimes those tubs of ice cream or you know, Hungry Jacks just sneak into one's mouth.
That good old gluteneomorphin.
Yeah. And so,
addicted.
You know, I'm fighting a difficult battle at that moment in time because, as I've mentioned, I can prove all that I want to. I can run the right blood test. I can do the right thing. I can suggest the right diet. But if the patient doesn't really like what you're telling them, they're not actually going to do it. And, you know, some days, and I totally get it, some days you're just tired. And the last thing you want to do is cook a paleo type meal and do all the preparations when you can just get kind of Uber Eats and get garbage on the spot in 10 minutes.
Well, it's very much that the things that you need to do to make you healthy, and after a while it's just exhausting. I had a not quite as complicated as what you're talking about, but a patient this morning who he's had a sort of double laminectomy at L23. And so, surprise, surprise, a super unstable low back where they've just taken his spinous processes completely off. So chronic low back pain, but we've managed to minimise that, and I've given him exercises to stabilise his back so that he doesn't get pain. But then he comes in today and says, oh, look, for the last 6 weeks, my back's been getting worse and worse and worse. And I'm like, well, okay, when did you stop doing your exercises for me to keep your back stable? About 6 weeks ago. So yeah, it's just, but it's just so difficult, that 10 minutes a day, it's boring, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, well, just don't come blaming me when your back pain gets angry when I've shown you. Anyway.
Yeah, that whole 10 minutes a day is way too hard.
Yeah.
Now,
Well,
in this lady's case, there is, because of the thyroid and the metabolism not working well, I can actually understand, I can empathize with her, how tired she is and low energy, and why that would be a struggle. But this is why, like, if you can afford it, and politely put, in this case, I actually know the family well enough to know that they could afford an au pair or someone to actually do the catering, to actually make the food for them, and there'd be no problem.
Just sounds amazing. Like, why wouldn't you?
But they don't.
Get someone to do all the work for you. That sounds.
Absolutely.
Anyway. Yeah. Well, again, at a certain point, you got to sit people down and say, "Here's how to get better." But you got to. What's that thing about leading a horse to water and all that nonsense?
So the other major interesting case that I had this week was a young lady who, and we'll go and touch on my favourite subject, which is gluten and how significantly bad it is for us. And I've got two of these cases. One of them, the first one, we started seeing about 3 months ago. High-level ballerina, teaches at a really high-level school, and we did a case history. She's got a Scottish mother. We went through everything. She's hypermobile, MTHFR, and a high probability of celiac disease. So in early March, I sent her to a GP to get blood tests done. She finally gets a call on Tuesday to come and pick up her blood tests. Oh, and by the way, you're celiac. So I've put her on a gluten-free diet anyway, but because she's not technically celiac, she's not, she's been 90%
following the menu.
Yeah. So, that food's a bit contaminated. I'll eat it anyway. It doesn't matter. It's okay. But, as it turns out, she's tall, lean, beautiful, and has struggled to get pregnant. Okay? So in the past, that is. And one of the issues, so she's got the celiac result, she started to have a look into it in a bit more of a significant fashion, because this is a hardline genetic result. There's no going back from there. So she's looking into it and suddenly finds out that people who are celiac who've been eating it have much higher risks of miscarriage and difficulty falling pregnant, and much greater risks of inappropriate hormonal function, and can't put on weight to maintain pregnancies, and a whole bunch of stuff like this. And suddenly she's like, bang, I'm on this. No, my husband, he's going to be gluten-free, and there's no cross-contamination, and you can't eat this anymore either, buddy, because if you kiss me and I've got like celiac, she is all over it. So it was a really...
Just find that magic motivation, or if a patient finally finds the magic motivation, you say, look, we can get rid of inflammatory markers and get you generally feeling better. And they're like, yeah, don't give a shit.
So
but
true.
Something like that, that's a significant motivator. I can totally see how that would work.
And then what you have to do when you're saying this to her is you kind of point out, right, well, I don't want you trying to get pregnant at this moment, because we've actually got to rebuild you properly, because you've actually been really malnourished. And while, physically you look like the epitome of what kind of the Western social imaging kind of shows, you're tall, slim, blonde, beautiful, but on the inside, you're lacking in iron, which we've already proven. You've got all this inflammation. If you were to get pregnant at this moment, your baby's level of nourishment might be compromised. You might have difficulty forming a decent placenta. Now, the problem is I can't sit here and swear on a Bible or whatever and say it's absolute. If you get pregnant, there's going to be hell to pay. But logic says that if you're already in trouble, pained, malnourished, difficulty in a bunch of different areas, and then you get pregnant on top of that, you're adding another stressor on top of your already stressed system.
Very much a giant parasite sucking off any little bit of nourishment that's coming. Yeah, that's going to be lose-lose. From that point of view, so in a patient like that, what would be your time frame to say, and let's say that they were super strict, did all the right things, ate all the right supplements and so on. How long would you say it would take someone to be biochemically well from that point of view? I mean, obviously it's going to be how long's a piece of string. And I do like giving you these yes and no answers, but...
Well, there's not very good news on this one. The actual kind of evidence, especially when looking at things like the Barker hypothesis, says that the state of maternal health and well-being and the nourishment of the mother for the 2 years prior to getting pregnant affects the outcome of the health of the child down to the 3rd generation.
Wow.
Okay, hang
on. So if mum's unhealthy for 2 years...
No, mum is unhealthy, but that state of health, whether she gets sick, malnourished or otherwise, in the 2 years prior to getting pregnant, will directly affect the epigenetics, genetics, the ability to nourish through the placenta and breastfeed the child. So if you're a smoker, you need to have stopped 2 years prior to getting pregnant, because that will directly affect the outcomes not only of your child, but if you have a female child, her ability to nourish her child. Okay?
Wow.
If you have a male child, you will increase. So your malnourishment, cigarette smoking, whatever it is, will cause a greater risk or a greater likelihood of non-insulin-dependent diabetes and heart disease in the 4th and 5th decade.
Holy shit.
Holy shit's right.
That's a big wake-up call for getting healthy if you want to get pregnant, or at least, planning on it.
Yeah, absolutely. So keep in mind what this means, and the experiments that they've done in a rat mammalian model is down 5 generations. So if we screw up the health of the dam now, her 5th litter down the line, even though they're eating full nutrients, etc., it takes till the 5th generation before you start seeing it improve again.
Wow. So the next couple of generations are going to be interesting to follow.
Well, you got to think what we're doing. So this stuff was all started after World War II.
What was the name of that hypothesis again?
Barker, Barker.
Okay. Yep, go on.
So they started doing population studies both in England and in India. You know, the British Empire took large amounts of baby records. And so what they did is they measured head circumference, liver circumference, length of the children. And then they compared to like the mothers and what the health was like in these different populations around the world. And they looked at what things like the Dutch potato famine and the Irish potato famine, and they compared these different populations of the health and well-being of the women prior to getting pregnant and what times affected them. And what was shown is that the state of the health, so like the women from World War II, you know, they were starved for several years, 5 years, and then they had full eating. You know, the war stopped, the rationing and restrictions stopped, but it took years before the health outcome of these children actually improved. And they followed these children like in 1980, etc. And this is where the stuff came out. So they did all the measurements early on, and then they followed up on them in the 80s and 90s, and they found all of these health problems. Now, what's really intriguing is those people who then are the generation who had you and me, and look at all our health outcomes, and then think of our children who are the hyperactive, ADD, autistic, etc., etc. Now, making this more entertaining is that these health outcomes are absolutely and consequentially affected by the amount of hormones and xenoestrogens in the mother's environment. So as I was saying, DES is a xenoestrogen that was given to help women with difficulty in their pregnancies, stop miscarriage, stop nausea. And what's been shown is that the next generation came out with some really interesting occurrences, including things like clear cell vaginal cancer. And what's now recently just come out is that these women's children, their offspring, were showing up with greater risk of ADD, ADHD, and neurological disorders. So the exposure to some of the chemicals that we've given to the women in the pregnancy, so in utero, has had negative outcomes on the second generation of children, as well as obviously cancer being a very, very nasty consequence that was unexpected. So exposure at different moments in time prior to pregnancy and during pregnancy has major impacts on the health and well-being, including epigenetic faults, neurological change, as I said, diabetes, heart disease, weight management issues, because as we restrict the nutrition, the drive to survive gets stronger. So the epigenetics in the mother's body and in the baby's body drive to actually hold on to body fat, because the body fat is going to keep them alive for longer. So they become much more sensitive to things like blood sugar change, insulin change, and this drives the offspring to put on more weight, become more estrogenized, and this is of course causing the great craze that we see in Western society called moobs. So, 6-year-old boys with breast tissue and 45-year-old men with very large breast tissue. And everyone says, you're just not doing enough exercise and you're eating too much. Well, that's possibly true, but it's significantly more complicated than that. And they've actually got these epigenetic faults in the background that are driving their bodies to store because of the high sensitivity, because of the stress their parents were under.
I was just thinking about that from a historical point of view. So, I mean, we went through Great Depression and then the famine, but then from the sort of 50s through to the 70s is the golden age of smoking. And then, you think about the noughts and Fukushima and all that sort of thing. Like, we've had enough crises around to affecting our health, like not even taking into account the inflammatory diets of what our Western culture has gone from, meat and 3 veg traditionally through to Macca's and a 6-pack.
Yeah. Well, there's just been so many really terrible things that we've done in that time period since, post-World War II and the golden age of, and I'm going to say the American civilization, because we've all, of course, tried to replicate that golden era. But we had the advent of plastic foods. So your margarines, everything was magical, space wrap, Tang, and because we all wanted to be astronauts because of the space race.
Around about the same time that article about butter killing people came out, wasn't it? That late 60s.
Yeah. And what we also did is we went, fat is bad, because Big Sugar, the sugar lobby, who really, really, really wanted to keep making money, paid some Harvard professors a large sum of money to produce some research which basically labeled sugar as quite safe and fats as absolute demons, and it was going to cause heart disease and you were all going to die. Now, novelly enough, not long after all that research came out, a scientific paper was published debunking that completely and basically saying that sugar was absolutely dangerous and that there was no danger from the normal traditional fats that we'd been eating, but because the credibility of the professors who were publishing it and the weight of the amount of them coming out, it was totally not listened to, and it's taken till this last couple of years for that data to actually start to swing into action. Same sort of thing happened with eggs and cholesterol. Cholesterol's the demon, it's going to kill you. It was all part and parcel of the same data collection and publication, and we're still paying the price for it now. So yeah, since post World War II, with the advent of antibiotics. Now, antibiotics are great, but what we did is we basically, any sniffle anyone had, antibiotics were the answer because this is our go-to new thing. This is great. Everyone needs these things that can't harm you whatsoever. Now we've got golden staph going on, and people are finding that, there's several infections that are basically not being killed off by anything. And this has led to neurological disturbances. There's this whole condition called PANDAS, and PANDAS is pediatric autoimmune neurological disorder acquired by strep. So the strep bacteria gets through the gut and the membranes and gets into the bloodstream and starts making antibodies, and those antibodies create inflammation that start attacking areas of the brain, and so the person's personality just goes off the deep end when they're having an inflammatory cycle. So inflammation and metabolic dysfunction is massively driven by it, because what food group do you think strep likes to live on?
Sugar.
Yeah, it is glucose. It's a glucose-consuming bacteria. So the SAD diet, the Western diet, standard Australian, standard American diet, which is massively fueled with carbohydrates. Because remember, you've got to have 12 servings of carbohydrate before you get to breakfast time, because anything that's nutritious should be banned, because you deflate and you lose energy when you don't have enough carbs in your life. I've seen the adverts on television. There's a wonderful branded company that actually did a cereal commercial where the child was deflated and rubberized and completely collapsed because they didn't have enough cereal for breakfast. Now,
I've seen that one.
I'm trying I don't want to malign them directly, but
let's not name
this
names.
stuff is categorically not true. Now, when you take the effects of something like the Barker hypothesis, whereby these people are being sensitized prior to the birth to being more responsive to sugar, this means their blood sugar goes up and crashes more. So the more blood sugar goes up from eating all the junk cereals and toasts, etc., the more insulin gets thrown in. The more insulin gets thrown in, its job is to take that blood sugar and store it as belly and ass fat. So the more carbs you eat, quite literally, the more designed you are to store, because it's an old hormone based upon survival. And it wants to keep you safe, because if there's stress, it's either something trying to harm you or no food.
Yeah.
And if there's no food, you're in
Carbs
trouble.
Plus stress and a genetic predisposition from stress, because your parents starved during the war and then smoked either tobacco or some other funky stuff. Jesus, extrapolates on. So the end result is, if you're in the position where you're planning to have kids, get healthy for 2 years and then get pregnant.
It's critically important. No one's wanting to look at it, because everyone's like, oh, I'll give up drinking as soon as I get pregnant, or people give up smoking 8 weeks afterwards when they work out that they missed their first period. Well, that's not going to serve you particularly well.
I suppose. I mean, at the end of the day, you're still getting people having. Is your kid as healthy as it could possibly have been? Like, they're going to survive, but are they going to flourish? That's the question.
And what makes it really hard is that because the human being is actually quite a robust, flexible system that can survive, because we do survive and we have kids coming out looking largely normal, and you don't see the problems for 30 or 40 years, the heart attacks occurring in 25-year-olds, breast cancer occurring in 30-year-old females, these aren't normal things.
Yeah.
Back in the 60s, breast cancer was traditionally considered a postmenopausal disease, and it was not usually estrogen receptor positive, let alone progesterone receptor positive. Now it occurs in women that are 25 to 35 years of age quite commonly, and it is common to be both estrogen and progesterone receptor positive. So we have done something in that last kind of 50-year period to actually alter the outcome. Now, from the research I did, I would say that xenoestrogens in our environment have a massive part to play. But what you have to keep in mind is, I blame contraceptive medication. I'm happy to do so. I'll stand on record and say it. I would not let my daughters have it. I think it's absolutely the greatest con we've sold womankind. Now, you know, people out there with the feminist bent will castigate me for that statement, but I'll clarify it. While we might have had sexual freedom, you know, the benefit of having sex without the consequence of pregnancy, and that's an important thing, and I don't decry that whatsoever, I honestly believe in the weighted scale of risk versus reward, the long-term negative incidence of outcome on the health of the woman taking the pill, her next generation and thereafter, is far too big, and it's actually messing up the epigenetics of the human population.
So from that point of view, I mean, you get people jumping on the pill for, consequence-free sex, but then also, you know, if you're having a period every 10 days, some regulation. Is the taking the pill for the purpose of regulating your period kind of a bandage approach? You're not really fixing the underlying cause from a biochemical point of view?
Well, it's kind of an interesting crux. At some point, we all have to change, don't we? We have to get methylation to work. We have to get the genes to actually shut down. And we know that things like xenoestrogens, whether it's from, Dildrim, DDT, these are both known xenoestrogens. The pesticides that we use on our gardens or in our food cereals, as well as antibiotics, are also known xenoestrogens. You know that arsenic's a xenoestrogen. So when you walk on old wooden stairs, like the stairs in the front of your villas in Sydney, so they have anti-termite sprays, etc., right? So that was commonly arsenic. And arsenic binds to the estrogen receptor and drives estrogen potentiation in the human body. So we've got all these sources going around outside of us that are affecting our metabolism, both male and female, but it's more risky in a female metabolism because it will affect not only her health, but the next generation's health as well. And it's in the literature, and no one wants to look at it.
Well,
we know
industry to shut down if you're right, mate.
Well, I've had arguments with different people about this sort of stuff, and everyone says, we don't use those things like DDT anymore. I'm like, what are you talking about? We still use it in the world. There are plenty of countries that haven't banned DDT just because Australia doesn't use it very often. And note that, because it's used for things like killing off mosquitoes. Now, without killing off, like it's a trade-off. You can have people die from malaria, or you can have people die in 20, 30, 40 years' time from cancer. So die now, die in 20, 30 years' time.
Yeah. Well, yeah.
Well, we're hoping.
That's a tough one because you don't know what you're introducing now. That's where's your 50-year study to prove that this is going to be? Let's do the 50-year study before introducing that when we've got a problem to fix right now.
Well, fortunately, we know categorically that these chemicals are carcinogenic. Now, it gets more interesting because it's part of the argument that I was having was ultimately I was comparing glyphosates, things like Roundup, with DDT. And the person like, stop being an idiot. We don't do that here when it's not used. I'm like, well, I've had a rural practice. I know that these things are still in use. Now, DDT is not commonly in use. I will point that out. But this stuff gets into the groundwater supply. I worked in an area where a school was closed and they had to investigate because the water supply was contaminated, and they found out that it was a herbicide, and the public response was, don't worry everyone, it's a chemical we haven't used in 30 years. Okay, so think on it. It took 30 years to get from the surface
How long
to
is it going to stick around?
ground. Yeah, it's going to stick around a long time. So these chemicals have a half-life of 20 to 70 years. So 20 years in really nice, clean soil, it breaks down quite happily. 70 years in highly acidic, overworked soil without lots of good microbes and etc. So these things are going to hang around and they drift down through the soil, they get into the water supply, and then we re-drink them.
Yeah, and hello Australian soil being acidic and malnourished and
Oh, yeah, it's bad. So just have a think, though. Think about Singapore. What do we do in Singapore? Well, Singapore's water supply is recycled water from the sanitary system, as far as I'm aware.
Right.
Okay, so do you think we have good enough filtration to remove the hormones out of that water?
Oh, hell no. Those things have got to be tiny.
Tiny, tiny, tiny. Absolutely.
Well, I was just thinking about on this sort of environmental toxicity point, like all of the Agent Orange that was dumped in Vietnam and the Vietnam War and all that sort of thing. Like that's got to be a doozy.
Yeah. That doesn't do us any good, and it's only really, really bad for foliage. It's not. There's not as much evidence to show that one actually affects down to the third generation, but that might be because I haven't looked too hard for it. But it's brought to you by the same people that bring you glyphosates. And that's a big company out there with a big M in their name. And, maybe since the evidence shows that they've known for about 20 years that these things cause cancer, but we don't talk about that because no one really likes to know that our favorite products that we kill our weeds with could be killing us as well. But, yeah.
That's a problem.
So we never got to the other patient. So I had the second patient. The other patient came in today, and I'd sent her to have bloods, and she came back in and she had the bloods there, and we chatted about it. And her GP basically said, "You're all fine, no trouble." And so I've sent her back with a letter to the GP saying, thanks very much for having seen X-patient. Really appreciate you taking the time. As I'm sure you'd appreciate having seen the results, that her IgE response of 1830 was quite high. So the normal IgE, which is a allergy anaphylaxis response of 0 to 100. So anything above 100 is... 1800 is a really, really high level. So it means, most likely in this instance, because she's not having anaphylactic shock hit her all the time, so it probably means that she's got 6 or 7 different allergies that are low grade, and so what I mean is significant, but not going to kill her at this moment.
Into anaphylactic,
but yeah.
Jesus.
But if we don't find it, it's going to keep getting worse, and at some point she'll go into anaphylaxis, most likely.
Just out of that scale, what would a score for anaphylaxis be if you did bloods immediately after someone went through anaphylaxis, if you were that mean? Like if 1800 is your constant exposure from an environmental toxin point of view, what's your anaphylactic score going to be?
Well, that's really high likelihood, the environmental toxins. In this instance, I think the most likely one is still gluten and potentially glyphosate. Both her and her sister, because we ran both of them, have extremely low iron. So, a ferritin level of under 30 in both instances, and both of them would benefit from a iron transfusion or an infusion. Both of them are low energy, anxiety, low motivation. And the practitioner has said, no, you're fine. Thanks, have a nice day. There are your results. And maybe that's because I was the person instigating it and they didn't like being told what to do, but c'est la vie. Further to that, the young lady's response showed up a positive IgM. So IgM antibody classes are for immediate early cytotoxic responses. So that says that she either has a current ongoing immune inflammatory response, either due to autoimmune condition or due to like an infection, strep, staph, cytomegalovirus or something. And it's currently occurring because it occurs right at the beginning. That's why we do those classes of like if you're looking for Epstein-Barr EBV, they do a EBV IgG and they do EBV IgM. So they're looking to see whether you've had the infection or whether you've still got the infection. So in this instance, we know that she's reacting to something. The top end of the range was 1.4 and hers was 2.7.
Okay, so she's still got something.
Yeah, so nearly double the range. Not quite, but bad enough that we're kind of thinking that something's definitely happening. Now, it could, in her instance, really be just purely celiac disease. So I've suggested that in this letter that she goes back and they do RAS testing for her allergies, refer her to a gastroenterologist to actually have a scope done, and while having the scope, get the infusion of iron done at the same time, so that we're kind of killing two birds with one stone. Now, the problem is we need to do it nearly immediately because she's on a gluten-free diet now and has been for a few weeks and feeling tremendously better. Her anxiety's massively dropped. She's no longer tearing up all over the place when put under any form of stress. She's actually feeling like going out. She's feeling like exercising. Grades are doing better at university. She can actually perform, which is a huge thing. And when I said to her, look, well, if we don't get this done quickly, I'm going to have to put you back on gluten, and she looked at me with that face like, what are you talking about? I'm not doing that. That would be a bad idea. And I can't say I blame her, but to do it properly, we either have to do it now to get those antibodies tested and the damage showing up in the gut lining.
Why the hell is he putting her back on gluten? You're just trying to provoke that response. Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah, because to get a positive test, you actually got to damage the person. So now, I know that sounds horrible, but
if the gastroenterologist takes too long to get to the table, you go, oh, look, the gut lining's clean. Yeah, I know, mate. That's because we haven't done any... okay, let's...
Yeah. Really common that occurs. It occurred with my daughter. The gastroenterologist said, oh, yeah, there's definitely no celiac. And my daughter looked at me and went, yay, I can eat whatever I want. I mean, you haven't eaten this stuff in 10 years, honey. And the gastroenterologist turned around and said, oh, yeah, just ignore what I said.
Well, I know which comment your daughter's going to gravitate to. That's for sure.
Yeah. So my patient has an appointment back with the GP tomorrow morning. I've sent her off with the letter saying, thanks very much, really appreciate your time. Could you please do these tests? And we've yet to see, obviously, what that outcome will be. But I'm sort of hoping that we can get a true confirmation for them that it really is celiac, because otherwise we're hunting for potentially a viral infection plus an allergy plus low iron plus, and it just keeps going on. It would be just nice if we could say, oh, it's one thing, it's damaging your gut, that's why your iron's low, that's why your B12 is low. This is what we're going to do. Stick to the diet you're on. We're going to give you an iron boost at this moment and then supplement. And as you heal, everything will go away. And that's my perfect package. Nice. But knowing my luck, that's not going to be what it is.
You'll have to keep us...
patience.
You'll have to keep us let us know how that pans out. If it does be a nice little one box tick for you, or if it turns into a nightmare. But I do have a bit of a bone to pick with you. Since we've been doing these podcasts, I've been asking all of my new patients, bring in your blood test, let me look at your iron levels, let me look at everything else. And the number of bloody migraine patients that I've fixed by just saying, do an iron supplement, and then they've not needed to come in for the 2 months worth of therapy with me to fix their migraines. So ethically it's brilliant because we've reduced the cost of getting healthy from, a couple of $1,000s with me through to, how much does your average over the counter iron supplement cost? About $30 or something?
I'm sorry about that.
Well, it's good for the patients is the main thing, and I'm glad I'm now asking these questions and I didn't get to the end of 2 months worth of hard work on my behalf only to go say, how are your migraines? No different? Oh, shit.
I think really what we're talking about here is not anything to do with that, because that's great and we both celebrate that. What the problem is that you are not legally allowed to tell anyone about that, and your patients are not legally allowed to tell anyone about that, because we have this really inappropriate regulatory system and an unlevel playing field here in Australia. And so because you're not allowed to actually tell anyone of what your skill set might give benefit to, you can't actually tell in advance the public that you could actually potentially help because of the questions you ask and how you look at things. Therefore, when those patients get well and don't need as much regular care, which is great, there's not the backlog of patients who really need your sort of care because we can't tell them that that's what we need.
I've just been telling everyone that I'm a graduate of the Wustenberg Institute of Biochemical Health. out
good.
of the University of Zimbabwe or something like that.
Yeah, well, see, if we could get around it somehow, I mean, without wanting to sound like too much of a rant, what we need in this country is a total overhaul of the health system. We have an unlevel playing field where medical doctors, and I'll use the term MD versus DC at this moment, have the financial backing of Medicare.
GPs versus chiropractors. DC stands for chiropractors.
Yeah. Well, they basically get patients funneled to them because the government pays for most of or all of their care. And therefore, what we have is that the GP becomes the gatekeeper of the funding, and they don't need to actually advertise because patients will go where the money pays for it because people are cheap and lazy, unfortunately. So, I'd like to see a change to that. Not because GPs aren't necessary and medicine's not necessary, but because they're not always the best people to solve the issue.
Mate, I couldn't agree with you more. There does need to be some form of a shift. I feel like some people are becoming, certainly over the last decade or so that I've been working in this industry, more recently people are being aware of sort of what their GP knows and what they don't know, and that the possibility of talking to someone outside of a GP might be, as part of someone's thought process with getting healthier. But still got a long way to go, that's for sure. Mate, we have had a beautifully wandering conversation today. We went from a microscopic patient conversation through to a big picture macroscopic environmental multi-generation health point of view.
Oh, wow.
Spiraling back down again. Mate, I love it. It's good.
If anyone wants to hear more about the environmental toxicity, it's one of my favorite topics, and it's really, really, really important. So if anyone out there listens to it and wants to send questions in and ask stuff about that one, please do so, because it's so important to not only your health, but future generations of health. And we could potentially get like agronomists and people with a whole bunch of environmental knowledge involved in that particular conversation, because the planet needs change no matter what. We have to get healthier than we are. When you think global warming, don't think, oh, look, just carbon. Think of the pollutants in our environment that are driving the ill health of both us and the planet.
Mate, that was a soundbite and a half. That was succinctly and beautifully put. Mate, if people do want to ask you or get in touch with you about environmental toxicity, what's the best email address?
The best email address to get us on is Toowong, TOOWONG, at optimallife.com.au.
Beautiful. All right, guys, let's wrap it up. Stay tuned for next time when I'll probably say environmental toxicity, and we'll get Scott talking about another aspect of that. But
awesome.
As always, thanks for listening.